Welcome everyone. I've put some talking points on the agenda. We don't have to talk about them. I just thought they may be things that people might want to talk about. So it's more of an invitation. If you can't see the agenda, I've put down the matter of having a Helm chart for Flux v2. I don't know if, Stefan, you want to talk about the proposal for bringing Flagger in that you just published?
No, maybe next week.
Maybe next week. Okay, fine. Multi-tenancy, just because it was talked about briefly recently. GoGit and libgit, if there are any developments there, and I thought I should mention GitOps days, which is the next 2 days, I think. So any takers for any of those subjects?
I also want to bring into discussion the Terraform provider. And,
okay, let me put that on.
So the problem with the current approach in the provider is the fact that we generate YAMLs from our Go package. So the generation is the same on both the Flux CLI and the provider. The problem with the provider is that there is no Terraform module that can apply a multi-doc YAML. Since that Kubernetes support is very low on Terraform, the HashiCorp provider, the official Kubernetes provider, cannot deal with YAMLs at all. You need to write the whole thing in HCL. Anyway, it's useless for what we do. So the problem is when we split the multi-doc YAML created by our package, the order is lost. So you get random failures of, oh, I cannot apply a deployment because the namespace is not there. Even if the namespace is there, but it's created from a different Go routine in Terraform. And for some reason, the package that we use, the kubectl package, has caching enabled or something like that, and it doesn't see what objects are already on the cluster. So it feels to me like Terraform is very broken in terms of dealing with Kubernetes. I don't know how to move forward. We can make some adjustments and create the namespace with the official Kubernetes provider, like hardcode the namespace in there, and only then apply all the other YAMLs randomly, because that's how it happens. Or I've been looking and I think we can disable parallelism in Terraform, but yeah, I don't think people want that.
Yeah, it's another option might be to switch to using kubectl as a null resource and just applying the full document. I guess
So
that's so just running a null resource and just running the kubectl command, and then just applying it with kubectl instead.
Yeah, but then you can no longer use only Terraform, right?
Well, yeah, Terraform can run arbitrary like shell scripts or shell commands.
Yeah, but you can no longer use only Terraform. You need on that machine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need
kubectl, you need to set your own context. You need the kubeconfig and all that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't think is the good way forward. I mean, if we do that, why not just shell out to Fluxctl? Why bother with anything?
Yeah.
If we're going to shell out.
Yeah. Another option is just looking at the provider and trying to fix the issues that we have in the kubectl provider.
Yeah.
It feels like it should be doable to solve. It's not really a difficult problem in theory, at least.
Yeah, for now, so we are stuck with the Terraform provider. We cannot advertise it because of this issue. So I propose the easiest way forward is to create a namespace and depend on that namespace creation for the Flux install command.
As in document it as the namespace creation being its own thing rather than being part of. Yeah. What about custom resource definitions? Do they suffer from the same problem, or is that less of a thing?
The controllers will crash loop until CRDs are there, so it's not a problem.
Okay, so they will eventually work.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll add a namespace then to the what's it called, to the guides and the examples, and then we'll have to document that you actually have to specify that outside of the manifest returned from what's it called, from the provider.
Yeah, so we can add it to the GitHub example and to the main README.
Yeah.
And then do another release. And then add the link to the Terraform provider from our install docs and see if people will pick it up. I didn't want to do that because from the end-to-end test, it's clear that the current provider is broken. Like, depends on, I mean, every single commit fails, right?
Yeah, it's weird because when I hate the fucking argument like saying it works on my computer, but it's like running the end-to-end tests otherwise it seems to work. So I don't really know what the differences are.
So Terraform will look up the number of CPUs you have and do a calculation, and based on that decides how many routines it uses.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing on the GitHub Actions virtual machine, it detects a bunch of cores, and that's why each file runs in parallel.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, we need to remove that retry hack because that doesn't work, and what it does, it just makes the whole thing fail for 6-7 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's.
Yeah. I get that.
We remove the retry and replace it with a namespace definition, and I think that should do it.
It's good to be explicit about creating the namespace first anyway, because it is like that's something that you might want to fit into your system with other things you're doing in Terraform potentially.
Well, the namespace is generated by us. This is just a hack. We'll create the namespace, then we'll override it, of course, because the namespace has its own annotations, labels, and so on that Flux needs. So
it gets updated, right? But don't you tell Flux install to go into a particular namespace, or is that hard coded?
Yes. No, you tell it. It's one of the provider's arguments.
Yeah.
So just use that argument, create a namespace before anything else, then we'll update the namespace.
Sure.
With our
I don't think it's unnatural to do that. I think that would be reasonable. You might do that if you were just doing it manually, right? You might think about it that way. That okay, where will it go? Let's create a namespace. Okay, now I'll install it and name that namespace. Even if the namespace itself gets updated by the install script, I don't think it's unnatural to do that in that order.
Yeah,
it feels like less of a workaround and more of just being explicit about something.
Yeah, it gives you some advantages. For example, you can have your own labels and annotations for that namespace, and they will get merged, not overwritten by us. So I don't know. A lot of people label system namespaces with something special, I don't know, to avoid gatekeeper or other things.
Okay, cool.
For example, in kubesystem, you deploy a CNI plugin, and that has to run as privileged. But for everything else, you want to block privileged containers. So the way you do it with Gatekeeper, you add an annotation on the system namespace. Hey, don't look at this namespace for now. It's managed only by platform admins. So yeah, you could use that reasoning for why you have to create a namespace first.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't saying it's a rationalization, just that it's, you know, it's not actually that far out of the realms of imagination. Okay, cool. Sounds like there's a good fix for that then. All right, so what do we got left?
So my thinking is, if we fix the Terraform provider and it really works, then we should advertise that and see how many people actually need the Helm chart outside of their Terraform use. Because every time I talk to someone that says, hey, I need the Helm chart for Flux version 2, and I ask him, why do you need it? They say, hey, I'm using Terraform and the Helm provider in Terraform. So before going forward with, hey, let's make this Flux V2 Helm chart, which I'm totally against, we should see if there is a need for it or not.
The person that brought it up, Daniel, didn't sound like, I don't remember the details, but I don't remember Terraform being mentioned. Guys,
No.
confirm that.
The way the discussion was written was literally, some customers exclusively use Helm to deploy applications to Kubernetes. So then it's not about being able to use a Helm chart in Terraform, but using Helm exclusively to deploy applications to their cluster. So in that case, you will still have people requesting a Helm chart to be able to deploy it.
Yeah. You can argue Flux is not an application, but a cluster add-on. You don't use Helm charts to deploy WeaveNet or Conical.
You can just argue that we don't support it right now, and we may be supporting it in the future, but right now it's literally not a problem we want to deal with, as I already wrote in the discussion, because as we all know, the amount of maintenance work that comes with a Helm chart is gigantic, and especially when you have multiple controllers all doing their own thing, and people needing settings for HTTP proxies or whatever, it's going to be a maintenance burden, and we simply don't have the time right now to be maintaining a Helm chart. We want to work on features. We want to work on expanding the Flux ecosystem. So the Helm chart is just not an option, and the community can easily deal with it themselves. At least that's my opinion. It should be relatively easy for them, if there is a need, to maintain a Helm chart and to keep it up to date with the changes we make. And we may choose to adopt it at a later moment when we want to maintain it ourselves. But right now, it's just not worth our time, or at least that's my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I think writing yet another installer is the less priority we have right now, right?
Yeah, I'm even a bit uneasy about people having an unofficial one, because where are the questions going to come?
Well, your answer is going to be it's an unofficial chart, and while we happily support people building that, we don't over support for it because it's unofficial.
Yeah, but how good do you feel about providing that advice?
I don't have a problem with saying that to someone, because it's
there will be pressure at least, you know, whether or not you
Yeah, but
personally.
it's also a great test if people build it and they see like, oh, due to, for example, the limitation of the amount of configuration flags, the maintenance burden isn't that high, or people seem to understand relatively well how the Helm charts are composed together. That would be a sign for us to choose to adopt it, because in the end our expectations of what it was going to be to maintain it weren't true. If no one's going to do that, then
yeah, I just don't expect that to be the case.
me either, but
My experience is that Helm charts very quickly become unmaintainable.
Yeah, I think I was there during that meeting when the whole Helm chart thing was brought up, and I basically pointed him towards looking at Open Gatekeeper or something like that. But in all honesty, somebody else who uses the Helm chart has to maintain it. It's kind of like me with a Terraform provider. I need a Terraform provider. I built it. It's like you can't just throw these type of things on everybody else just because you need it. It's kind of harsh, but yeah.
Yep. I think if it worked, then a generated Helm chart, like purely generated, I would be okay with that. There would be, it'd still be a maintenance burden, right? However, I think there would be pressure there would still be the normal pressure with a Helm chart, which is, can you add my option, my favorite option in? I like to mount a volume for some reason, you know, that sort of stuff. And
yeah, that's why
with a generated one.
That's why Scott mentioned the pose renderer, because the pose renderer was invented to use basically public available Helm charts, but you want to put some customization on top of it, but don't want to wait for people to either accept your PR or your PR got rejected. Then you can use the pose renderer to basically tie your own kind of, I don't know, customization kind of approach or any other patchway on top of the render output from Helm. And then the pose renderer hooks into that, accepts your or takes your customly rendered output and uses that as the thing it deploys. So there you could say, okay, we deliver a basic chart, and then you can make use of Helm's post render functionality to customize it. But the problem I see then is, for example, the Helm controller doesn't have any post render options right now. It's one of the feature requests, but I haven't had time to look into it yet. It's pretty complex to set it up.
Very brittle as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like the flux.yaml we invented for Flux V1, because it literally accepts, you can run any iterary command basically, and pipe the output from the Helm render to it, and then it accepts whatever you feed it back. So that's, while it's another solution, it's not one I would like to advertise, because I can see people requesting support for their own custom built solution, which are issues that often take a lot of time to resolve, because you first have to understand their world.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's just pushing the complexity elsewhere, isn't it? It doesn't, and I think it makes the situation worse, if anything, quite honestly. So yeah, the problem with generated charts might be that people end up using customizations on top of it or something, and then they're in a worse situation than just with a chart. Also means that the chart's output is now effectively the contract, because changing it means probably breaking someone's customizations. So it's not even, you know, in a Helm chart, your contract, if you like, is the values. And you can choose to interpret those values in the templates. But if you've got a customization or arbitrary customizations on top of the output, then now the output is your contract, because changing it, yeah, could break a patch somewhere.
Yes, I think the conclusion is still that we have to disappoint people for at least a little while.
Yeah, I don't really know what's going to change though.
Well, I can imagine that once we are more mature and we are pretty sure that, for example, custom resources aren't going to change, or that we are working on smaller features instead of creating this whole world of things, that we have a bit more time to deal with user experience from an installation perspective, and that you want to add it because it attracts new users. And then it's a trade-off you make, right? Or we have more maintainers, for example, or more maintainers who are able to deal with the issue. Then you can rethink your choice of not supporting it, because if a lot of people ask for it, there is a market. But in the current situation, it's a no.
Okay, well, I guess Daniel, who brought this up in the last meeting, I think having an unofficial, unpublished almost chart would work for them. Unpublished, or unpublicized.
Yeah, I've already seen at least 2 or 3 people create their own. So people are doing it. If they would just bundle their forces and work on it together, they all have their solution.
Mm-hmm.
My major concern with the Helm chart is the fact that once we do that, Flux will no longer be able to upgrade itself. And that's a shame, because that's what Flux 2 should be doing. That's what Bootstrap does. And it's impossible to bootstrap Flux on a cluster with just Helm. Helm has no way of, I don't know, defining its own state in a Git repo, set up deploy keys, and all that thing. And having a Helm release definition inside your Git repo and make Helm controller upgrade all things, it will not going to work, because it will not be able to upgrade the CRDs. So if you use a Helm chart for Bootstrap, from that moment on, it's almost impossible to self-upgrade.
As Daniel mentioned last time, I think it was a quote, or I don't know who mentioned it last meeting, but anyway, there are a couple of hacks to make Helm upgrade CRDs. One is creating a dedicated chart with only these CRDs, which are templates and not CRDs put into the CRDs folder. The other one is post-installation or post-upgrade hooks. So there are ways people make CRD upgrades work. The problem is that they are designed to work around Helm limitations, and that is not officially supported. And you need to be pretty sure that the thing you're using the tactics for is able to cope with how you apply those changes to the cluster, or how Helm applies those changes to the cluster using those hacks. So there are ways. The question is, if it's unsupported by Helm, do we want to support such unofficial ways of dealing with a limitation they put up themselves? The CRDs, creating a custom chart for CRDs is an advertised way of dealing with the issue by Helm, by the way.
Sorry, hit it. It's the what way?
If you look at the Helm documentation, they have two ways basically of dealing with the limitation they put up. The first one is the one that's most commonly known, and that's the fact that they have this CRDs folder where you put in the CRDs. Helm checks if the CRDs are present on the cluster. If they aren't, it just applies the CRDs and then ignores them for further upgrades. That's option 1. Then you have option 2. Option 2 is creating a dedicated chart where you don't put the CRDs into the CRDs folder, but you put them into the templates folder.
Oh, I see.
And then it deals with the CRDs as if they are templates, and then it just runs an upgrade if you tell it to run an upgrade, and then it just applies the new version of the CRDs. The reason that they are careful with advertising that is the fact that it's not really known in Kubernetes land what controllers do when a new CRD version comes up, because it can be that your controller only accepts the old version or only the new version. So that's why they're really cautious about advertising this, because there's no consensus on how controllers deal with this issue.
Yeah.
Another thing, I kind of missed that there. Were you saying that you were going to put the CRDs in a separate chart? So you have one chart for the CRDs and one chart for the actual setting up the controller and the sync and everything, or?
Yeah, and the reason I think they do that is because you can then basically choose yourself what you upgrade first. Either you upgrade the application first and it will first deal with the old CRDs, and then you apply the chart with the CRDs, or upgrade the chart with the CRDs next, and it takes over or something. But they specifically highlight the separation of CRDs and the controller making use of it.
Yeah, a big reason for that is because if you put your CRD definitions in the templates and then you try to create a resource with that CRD, the first time around it's going to fail, even though you can like set priorities. Helm will not be able to create your custom resource. Yeah. So you need to run 2 separate charts, and then that becomes like somebody needs to maintain them once again.
That's probably enough talking about Helm for the minute.
Yeah.
To get all the kind of issues in one place, though. Philip, did you have a chance to, I know it's only been a few days, did you have a chance to look at using libgit2?
I have not, actually. I've been
Okay, no worries.
busy with other stuff. So my hope is I'll get some time during this weekend.
So just to remind people, the reason libgit2 comes up is that it supports multi-ack, and GoGit does not, and the prospect of GoGit supporting multi-ack seems very unlikely, very thin prospect. The maintainers reported that they just don't really have the time either to do it themselves or even to review PRs by the sound of it.
It wasn't really reviewing PRs. I think they have
Okay.
time to review PRs. It's more that they did not really want to have a half implementation, even though one of the old maintainers said that that would be a way forward in like previous statements. But it's it kind of worries me that we're building something around a dependency that it seems like they're just kind of in maintenance mode, even though they don't want to say it right now.
Sounds a bit like it, doesn't it?
I had a colleague who did some tests with libgit2 or whatever you call it. And I understand that one of the bigger issues actually with selling everybody on moving over would be to make sure that the development experience is not a pain in the ass just because we're using a C dependency. I see that as one of the biggest challenges actually, because I can't just go, oh, we should totally change, but you now have to do 300 steps to just set up a development environment to make a PR for a source controller. It can't really be that way. So it's, I think that's what's going to take the most time, at least.
Yep. Used libgit2 before, and it is just a brew or apt, or it's in package managers, so I don't think it's. But
Yeah.
we certainly want to make sure of that.
Yeah.
There are some concerns around, my concerns around how we build the toolkit controllers. So we use build kit from Docker, and we use the Alpine images with multi-arch support, so we can build ARM64 and ARM in the same image, and AMD64 and so on. The problem with the Go bindings is the fact that the Git package itself is not thread safe. So that's not a really concern for Git itself, because Git is a CLI. So you run a process with a single command, no issues there. The problem is we'll be running all of these operations in parallel inside a single process, which is the source controller process. So we cannot, just use the Go bindings. We need to include OpenSSH, the OpenSSH bindings, and make sure that the C code from Git creates a lock with the OpenSSH libraries, and that lock transfers to mutex inside the Alpine image. Problem is that this cannot be compiled on Alpine, because Alpine doesn't come with CGO support. So we need to install, how is it called? We also did that for Flux. So in Alpine, we need to install the OpenSSH dev libs or something like that.
Yeah,
And
looking,
Alpine muscle.
There's a thing on threading in the Git2 docs that talks about OpenSSL. So on. I mean, yeah, it would at least take quite a fair bit of kind of research and diving into this stuff to be sure that there aren't problems there.
Yep.
And also run long tests, because Go routines are not threads. And if you run source controller on how it is today with one CPU as the limit, you'll never run into a multi-threading issue, because it's a single thread, physical thread. So it will not panic. But once you run source controller on a very strong machine that has many CPUs and you remove that limit, then everything could break because the mutex is not created. And how can you even detect that the mutex is not there from Go? You can't, because that's unsafe code and you have no visibility into that. So someone that knows how to debug OpenSSH and C and everything else should be looking into this. So it gets really complicated once we are in C land from what we are used to in Flux, where we only deal with Go.
Git2Go was the specific one. I think that's the one I've used before as well. The bindings, I mean.
My worry is really like what happens in the future, because I see it as a possibility that we go, no, this is too complicated, and we can just stick with GoGit. And then a future comes where GitHub goes, yeah, sure, now you need to actually implement multi-act detailed, or you have to implement multi-act, or some other feature that is now required. Who is going to implement that into GoGit? Because it's like I've I've gone kind of deep into GoGit, and it's like it requires a very good understanding of Git itself and the Git wire protocol and everything around that. So it's like that's the other side of it is really longevity of the project.
Yep. Another thing that we are blocked on with GoGit. So, for example, you can tell source controller to connect to multiple Helm repositories using self-signed certificates and use dedicated certificates for each repo. That works fine, but it's impossible to do it with Git because how GoGit is built, the HTTPS client is global. So you cannot tell to Git, hey, trust this certificate only for this repo. Once you say, hey, trust this certificate, then it's global. And that doesn't quite work for us because, yeah, source controller should be able to connect to no matter how many repos, and each repo can have its own cert. So I don't know if with the Go bindings that will work. I couldn't tell from looking at the Git to Go code if you have to deal with the OS SSH client or not. Can you load the keys from memory? Can you load certificates from memory and all of that? Or you have to do with mounting files on disk, like the whole Flux V1 jazz?
I think a lot of the things are probably going to be dependent on the OS and doing things in file and then reading it into memory.
Yeah, I find that unacceptable. We cannot store SSH keys on disk inside source controller.
Yeah. These things are obviously going to be a bit more obvious when I get a POC working, and then we can look at it around there. It's kind of, it feels like there's no good solution no matter what we do. There's always going to be things that we have to kind of just accept and or not accept with going with GoGit or with the Git to Go. So it's, yeah.
Just thinking about coming at it from a different direction. I wonder if we can persuade someone to adopt GoGit.
Yeah, that's actually another option. Really, is I guess one of the comments from one of the maintainers was, if you read verbatim, it's he said something about if there were a lot of corporations or companies that were depending on GoGit, really, then they should spend the time or actually the money on it. One option is really to sponsor the project if it's that important, if it's that good, to actually do these types of things so that they can actually maintain it.
Yep.
Because I don't know, it's it seems like they actually know what they're doing there with the whole GoGit stuff. And it's hard to find somebody who could take over the project.
Yeah, so it used to be a particular company, didn't it? And then they spun it out into its own org. I don't know whether it's still just people from that company.
I think it is, but it was like some kind of, I don't know. They just spun it out into a separate org and just took it away from the company, or I don't know really what happened there.
The README says legal issues with the source D organization.
Used extensively by Keybase. Keybase got bought. Maybe they've got a bunch of money they could throw at it. All right. I've taken us off into the weeds of this discussion. Sorry.
That maybe explains why some of the Git keybase functions don't work on Linux, for example. I'm not able to create a private Git repository haven't been for years, like 2 years now. Because it just doesn't work.
Okay.
So I've looked at source code of GoGit, so you can create the keys in memory, bind it to an unsafe pointer in C, and then provide the pointers to GoGit itself. So we'll have to manage our own memory. It's like, this is great. I mean,
That's C bindings for you.
yeah. So you can actually use memory as long as it's unsafe and you do locking.
Yeah, that's pretty normal. Lots of JK has to do that because it's dealing with V8, which is in C++. So it has kind of a C binding into that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine how
And
source
management.
controller should look like. We'll be spending months on debugging some memory leak. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
We should try it out and decide after we have a proof of concept that actually works with Azure DevOps and GitHub.
Yeah, I mean, modulo, people actually being able to work on it and having the time and so on, just having protocol v2 support in GoGit seems the ideal, doesn't it? Oh, and the other thing, the well, using different sets, being able to support that.
Yeah, for that, the whole thing has to be refactored because they use these global clients, which can no longer work. So,
yeah, right. So you have to thread the transport all the way through.
they have a global option, and from there everything gets set up, which is something that's understandable if you are building a CLI. We've seen the same stuff with Helm as well. Like things are meant to be run once and then destroyed in a single process, so no multi-threading concerns, no multi-certs or anything like that. So
same with use of open API schemas in KYAML. It's the global.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Maybe we could persuade GoGit to put some bounties on some of these things. There's at least a couple of, Tidelift is one, a couple of sort of open source crowdfunding type things. I mean, if it's a matter of a few $1,000s or something, maybe someone just is happy to pay for it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay. What else did I have on the talking point? GitOps days is the next couple of days. Probably everyone here is already involved one way or another anyway, but I thought I should mention it. Philip, are you involved in GitOps days? I would guess you know about it at least.
I know about it. I'm not actually, so I was going to probably just sit and listen.
It's going to be during your working hours, so a bit tricky.
Probably
but
fine.
Yeah,
I can just have them in the background.
Neat, good idea. That's all the stuff that I thought that I just came up with off the top of my head to talk about. Any other stuff? Anything else someone wants to table?
There is a pull request open for enabling customized plugins. I've invited that person to this meeting. We'll see if they want to join. the implementation is you'll be placing your plugins in Git, like Linux binaries, whatever you want. It's in your Git repo, and then you'll tell customized controller, hey, the plugins are here, so please enable them. So it's an opt-in feature. The problem is that with multi-tenancy, maybe the platform admin wants to disable plugins for everybody. And since it's in a customization object, is not quite possible. So I'm guessing we have to add yet another flag.
Don't like flags, especially not modal ones like that.
Yeah. Or I don't know, tell people, hey, you have to use Gatekeeper and block customizations that, I don't know, are enable plugins on your cluster. So if this plugin home field exists, deny the manifest, deny the object. That can be easily done with OP and Gatekeeper, but I don't know how many people have adopted Gatekeeper.
Security by default would be that you have to explicitly enable it, wouldn't it? But that doesn't, that just becomes a modal thing again.
Yeah. Yeah, the discussion is, hey, why do you care? You create these controllers, it's up to the user, but yeah, I think we should do more than just create the controllers. We should also define how they should be used. So
was there a specific use case that motivated the PR?
Yeah, they use some plugins. They don't say what. They use plugins. So they want plugins. It was possible with Flux version 1 because you could add an init container and copy everything in there. Now it's not possible because I've enabled read-only FS everywhere. And the init container hack will no longer work.
Could you mount an extra volume in both places and then in both containers, like in the init container and in the thing, or what is that?
So even if you do that, let's say, even if you create a new volume, so you create a new volume, you add your init container, you copy your binaries, customized controller will never allow plugins because it's an alpha feature in customize and disabled by default. I haven't enabled that. Why would I? So you need to modify the source code, and when customized controller calls the customized package, there is an option there where you have to tell customize where your plugins are. That's the first thing. Then you have to tell customize explicitly, hey, run plugins for me. So yeah, we should discuss that maybe at the next meeting, the late one, maybe that person will join and we'll find out more about it. Another issue somehow related to that is SOAPs decryption with KMS. So how KMS works, you have to bind, you have to run the customized controller pod under a service account, and that service account has access to cloud APIs, like has access to KMS to read some particular key. And this is how SOAPs can fetch the private key in order to decrypt things. Now, we have multi-tenancy support through service accounts where we tell you can configure a customized controller to run a particular customization applied under a service account. The problem is the service account is not used for SOAPs. We use it only to apply stuff. We don't use that service account decrypted because
the impersonation account. Yeah. It's the account that the controller is running under that's used for matching up IAM and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a multi-tenancy situation, you'll have to bind multiple IAM roles to the same pod. You can do that, of course. The problem is then one tenant can decrypt secrets from another tenant. And that's like really, really bad. So we have to find a way to use impersonation in SOAPs, or use a gRPC server, create pods for each customization, run the pod under that particular service account, connect from a customized controller via gRPC to that particular pod. The pod will be able to access KMS and only that KMS instance because it will run under that particular service account and so on. That's one way to do it.
The pod will have to run in the tenant's namespace, presumably, because that's where the service account is. Is that right?
So you know where the service account is. So yes, where is that service account? You'll create the pod exactly there. Under that service account, connect to it, fetch the key through gRPC, which is not encrypted. So we also have to set up MTLS on our own.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about this before, haven't we? I'm remembering.
Yeah.
And an alternative is to do everything up to applying in the pod, potentially. Like do the whole pipeline.
Yeah, it complicates the stuff a lot.
But yeah, but either way, it's very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I asked you privately about the multi-tenancy thing. That's just stopped because it got so far and then there was no one to work on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I asked Lee what's the status. He said he will be contributing the fix to upstream Kubernetes and wait for that, and maybe afterwards work on Flux, so we could look at months for that. I think we should do it on our own. And
does the upstream fix, excuse me, is that necessary for any design? I can't remember what it fixes.
So Kubernetes, kubectl impersonation is broken when you run it inside the cluster.
Okay.
It doesn't work.
Got it.
And that's why I made the impersonation from Go code. So from Go, I'm using client Go, the Kubernetes client Go, I'm getting the service account from the cluster, find the right token, then tell kubectl, hey, use this token. Instead of doing kubectl as this particular service account, run it because it fails. The workaround for this is to create a shell script. And instead of calling directly kubectl, you'll be calling this shell script that mounts, forces kubectl to respect the impersonation command when it runs in cluster. You have to set up environment variables and a bunch of stuff.
Oh, so it kind of cheroots it almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it won't exist, but.
Yeah, I mean, setting some environment variables before you run kubectl, I think it's acceptable. I don't see any kind of issues. We shell out anyway to kubectl, so okay, we'll shell out and add 3 environment variables. Yep. But once we do that, we can use the right impersonation command, then we can impersonate users. My current implementation cannot impersonate users because a user doesn't have a token. A user doesn't even exist inside Kubernetes. It's just a binding. This name
string
has this RBAC, right? There is no cryptographical identity inside the cluster. like for service accounts.
Yeah,
So,
it just believes you, basically, doesn't it?
yeah. Which is a good thing in a way, because then creating service accounts means creating tokens. Kubelet has to refresh those tokens. The more service accounts you have, the more CPU it will use, and so on, because of all the key rotations and all of that. It doesn't scale if you have like thousands of things to create thousands of service accounts. It will put a lot of pressure on etcd. But yet again, if you use a self-hosted hosted service, then you don't care and you can do whatever. But the proposal was to drop service accounts and just use users. And I don't think that's good for a couple of reasons. Once we say, hey, impersonate, you no longer can specify service account for customization, that means we'll no longer be able to implement SOAPs like ever, because you cannot bind something to a user from iRoll. All the bindings, everything that happens with the cloud services, it will bind to something that has a token, that has a cryptographic identity inside Kubernetes, and that's a service account, right? So if we remove the service account, then we'll be losing all of that.
Yeah. What was the motivation for dropping service account? Because it didn't work.
So you said when we discussed last time that you find, hey, this is confusing. Why we will allow service accounts and users? Let's just allow users, and that simplifies because people don't have to think of two options.
Did I say that? No. No, it seems reasonable to support both to me now, anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe you want to change your comment.
Setting stuff up, and you have, two tenants, and you look after them. They're just different teams in your organization. You're not trying to support arbitrary numbers. Then service accounts would be completely fine, wouldn't it?
Sure.
In fact, it may even be preferred.
Yeah.
Then you don't have to set up authentication or whatever.
The advantage with the service account is that you can create that service account not only for the GitOps pipeline, but also for all the things that are running under a particular tenant.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe you have a rule where you do not run on the default service account. There is a service account that it's assigned to you, and everything should be running under that because reasons, role bindings, gatekeeper rules, pod security policy, which requires a dedicated service account in order to apply that, and so on. So I'm for keeping both of them and implement the environment variable hex until upstream Kubernetes fixes the impersonation in cluster.
And that also means that the sort of convenience commands for multi-tenancy can work without there being an extra modal flag. Is that right? As I understood it, one reason for introducing a flag was to kind of stop some particular behavior. But the reason, let me try and rewind my thought process. But the reason that people might do that is that they were trying to avoid using service accounts. But actually, if they can use users, that problem no longer exists. Something like
so that. The idea, we need a flag in order to tell customized controller and hopefully in the future Helm controller, hey, if you are not running in the system namespace, if that particular reconciliation, the customization of the Helm release is not created in the system namespace, then you have to look for a user in that namespace where the object is created. Right. That's why we need a flag. Because if you don't set up with a flag, then everything will broke once people will upgrade to anything. maybe you don't care about multi-tenancy. Maybe you just want to refer whatever service account you want because this is what you're doing, right? So without that flag, if we turn this stuff on, everybody will have their setups broken, and they have to create users everywhere in all lines.
Oh, wait a second though. So why would it stop working? I didn't quite get that. The impersonation would stop working, or?
No. Once you, so if we implement the user thing is will tell the controller, hey, you cannot run any kind of reconciliation under cluster admin.
Yeah, okay, fine. So if you
look
add
for
that,
the
then put it behind
user.
a flag.
Yeah, look for the user inside that namespace, and the user is not there because people don't care about multi-tenancy, and that will break. So that's why I'm thinking we need a flag to switch the controllers to this restricted mode where service account or the user must be specified.
And what's the motivation for the restricted mode? Because you can do all this without having the controller do something special, right? As long as you set it up in the right way. As long as you, the user, set it up in the right way. That's my understanding, at least. Like you want the service account or user that has the permissions inside the tenant namespace to live not in the tenant namespace or something. Oh God, it's mind bending for me. But
so no, let's say you create a Helm release and you don't specify a service account or a kube config or a user. You don't specify anything. By default, it runs under cluster admin. That's how it works.
Right.
So now, if you want to, in order to enforce multi-tenancy, you have to tell the controller, if nothing is specified, then look for the Flux user in the namespace. If he's not there, bail out. If we don't have a flag, then Helm controller will always look for that user, and the user is not there. And people will say, hey, I don't care about multi-tenancy. Why? Now I have to create, besides a Helm release, now I have to create also a user and a role binding and the cluster role binding if the Helm chart has CRDs and all that stuff. So if we enforce the multi-tenancy model on everybody, we'll be complicating everybody's life.
Yeah, no. Yeah,
that's why I think a flag is more meaningful, because only a couple of users have this multi-tenancy requirement. Many of those don't.
Right. And could you not default to using the default service account in the namespace of the Helm release? Or
the default service account, the account has no access to anything. Not even, you cannot even query namespaces. So you cannot install anything.
Yes. So that would require, okay, that would require extra setup on behalf, but at least it's secure by default, as opposed to what happens now, which is you can basically do anything. As a tenant, if you're allowed to create a Helm release, then you can do anything in the cluster, effectively, at present. Yeah, okay, so that needs fixing, obviously. Yeah, okay.
That needs fixing if you are dealing with tenants. But if you're not dealing with tenants, then we'll make you, hey, from this moment on, you can no longer use Helm releases everywhere. In that namespace, you have to create a cluster role binding, a user, and bind the user to that role that gives cluster admin access to that Helm release inside your namespace. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll fail.
Or run it in the system namespace and target the other namespace. Yeah.
Or put everything in Flux system, with secrets, with everything else, right?
Yeah. Create a namespace that has the permissions you want, or whatever way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a shame.
I added target namespace to the customization object as well. So if you really want to do that, you can. Like you can use only Flux system to create all the toolkit objects, and you can target whatever namespace you want. But this will not work for everybody, of course. You expect your hand release, especially your hand release, to be in the namespace where you deploy it, because it's just like a Kubernetes deployment in a way, right?
So if the flag actually just changed the default behavior, that would be okay, right? Is that what it does? The multi-tenancy flag, it just changes the default behavior if you don't mention a service account or user in your customer.
So when you say multi-tenancy, the flag, then the controllers will do the current check. Hey, is this object that I'm reconciling in my runtime namespace? No. Okay, then I have to look for either a service account or a user in that namespace. If it's not there, error out.
Yeah, sure. What I mean is, if you name a service account in your customization, does it ignore it if you have that flag, or does it
no,
respect
it ignores it. It will ignore it. It will not ignore it. It will error out if the namespace of that service account doesn't match the namespace of the customization. It will not let you use
with a service account that's not in your namespace.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
You can specify whatever namespace there you want.
That seems
because,
like a problem.
What?
That seems like a problem.
No, that's how you would do delegation, right? So when you say use this hand release target that namespace, then you want to use a service account, right, from a different namespace, from the Flux system namespace, for example. That's how WKP works and many other things.
Not the namespace it's targeting?
No. Why would it? A tenant can have more than one namespace, can have like 10 namespaces. So we'll create one service account in, let's say, a system namespace. You bind that service account to all these other namespaces that the tenant has access to, then all the customizations will run under a single service account, and that service account is limited to 10 namespaces. You don't have to create a service account per namespace. You can create a service account for a tenant, and I think that's the right approach.
We should probably continue this discussion on record in that proposal, shouldn't we? We've just gone 12 minutes over time.
Okay.
Blame myself. Sorry. Okay. Thanks, folks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Cheers.